G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Life of the Messiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We're up to paragraph 121 and 25. Last session, we saw the rich man and Lazarus. Remember, the Jewish rabbinic theology was that if you're rich, it means that God's favor is upon you. But we see the rich man, Lazarus, they both died, went down into Sheol, and rich man who should have been in the good side, ends up in the bad side. And whereas the beggar who didn't have any riches on the earth, he ends up in Abraham's bosom. And so we see down there that rich man is in Sheol, Lazarus, Abraham's bosom. And we see that there is a gulf separating the two. There's no crossing over. But we also know that the state of the lost, it's eternal. They are eternally separated from God. There is no second chance. And we did see that down there in Sheol, where we said it's in the center of the earth, we see that in the hell side, there are three compartments. We have one which is there for a permanent place of confinement for demons. There's one which is for a temporary place of confinement for demons, which is the abyss. And then there's a place where men go to. And we also spoke about the fact that when Jesus died, he went into Abraham's bosom and he told them down there that the job was done, the atonement was made. And when he ascended, he emptied out Abraham's bosom, and now every believer who dies goes straight to be with the Lord. Abraham's bosom is now empty. There's no one in the righteous side of Sheol anymore. All done. Everyone who dies today goes down, who is an unbeliever, goes down into Sheol, there to remain until the great white throne judgment. We saw concerning service, the story of a servant. And we need to remember that, Jesus is the master, and everything that we do because that's a servant's job. And we do all things for him. And we also saw that our faith is increased by actually being in service to the Lord and seeing the Lord answering prayers as we go through in the service. And we see that will increase our faith as we see Jesus working and answering prayer. That's how our faith is increased. Then we see coming into the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, this is a different Lazarus, not the other Lazarus with the rich man. This is Mary and Martha and Lazarus, the brother. We see that Lazarus's death has a divine purpose. His sickness was going to lead to his death. The purpose of that would be to glorify God. Now, we see that Jesus remains away from Bethany after he's called to come down. He stays up there quite a while until Lazarus actually dies. And then he goes down, takes a casual stroll down. It's only a one-day trip, but he takes about 3 days to get there. And when he gets down there, Mary and Martha, both of them scold Jesus for not coming earlier, because they figured if he was there earlier, then he could have healed Lazarus. But they didn't actually believe that he had power over death. They didn't believe that he could raise Lazarus now from death. They did believe that they recognized his power before death, but not over death. And so that's why they scolded him. Now we come to this session now where we're going to come to Jesus and Lazarus. And remember, this has to do with the sign of Jonah. Now, in John chapter 11, verses 33 to 34, that's where we are in the passage of John. This is a very crucial section now, because according to verse 33, it says, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit. Now, a more literal rendering here is not just weeping, but they're wailing. Mary was wailing along with the other Jews who are probably professional wailers as well. Everybody was wailing. And the word which is used, the Greek word for wailing here, means very loud wailing, which is a common practice at Jewish funerals. In fact, it's a common practice at Middle Eastern funerals. You know, when it says he groaned in the spirit in verse 38, John 11, and groaning in himself, the translation for this is that he was moved with indignation in himself. He was angry. On the one hand, he was angry at their unbelief, but also in this context, he would be angry at what death has done to the human race and to his friend Lazarus, and what sin has caused in humanity, which is physical death. Now, in this spirit that he's in, he arrives at the location of the tomb in verse 34, and he says, "Where have you laid him?" And they say unto him, "Lord, come and see." In verse 35 of John 11, we read, "Jesus wept." The Greek word which says that Jesus wept means that he shed tears silently. He wasn't wailing like the women were. He was just crying silently. The Greek word here is different from the other word that is used for the wailing bit. Now, among the multitude standing and wailing were the ones who, according to verse 37, said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of him who was blind have caused this man also not to die?" Remember, these people had witnessed the miracle back in paragraph 103, where Jesus healed a man who was born blind. And it says back in John 9:32, "Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind." Why? Because that was considered a miracle that only the Messiah could do when he comes. And Jesus did that. And that's why they're saying, hey, couldn't this man who did that just have healed this Lazarus? This is a much less significant miracle, and one which would not have been messianic, to raise Lazarus from the dead, or to raise Lazarus before he had died, to heal him before he had died. It was a relatively simple miracle in Jewish thinking, healing a man. So from their perspective, from the multitudes there, they said, why had he not performed that minor miracle and kept Lazarus from dying? Now, and using what we call the Calvacoma argument, they reasoned that Jesus could also do a lesser miracle and heal Lazarus. Why? Because he did the greater miracle by healing a man who was born blind. Only the Messiah could do that, because as far as they were concerned, as far as Rabbinic Judaism was concerned, that was a divine judgment upon that child in the womb. And so what they're saying is that was a much greater miracle. Surely Jesus could have come down here and healed this man who was sick. And so this results in verse 37, Jesus again groaning in himself. Again, he's moved with indignation. Again, anger at their lack of understanding of the purpose of his mission. And remember, John spends a lot of time on this in this passage dealing with Lazarus, because this is a very crucial point. This is a turning point. And at this point, according to verse 39, Jesus ordered the stone to be taken away. But Martha, who would be the one careful about these things, objects to his command by saying, "Lord, by this time he stinks, for he has been dead 4 days." It's not a nice thing to say about your brother, but that would be true. He would stink. Now, the mention of 4 days here is very significant in the light of Jewish theology. Jesus deliberately waited for Lazarus to die, and for what would have taken a one-day walk, it took him 4 days to get there. So it is 4 days by the time he arrives, and Lazarus was dead. But again, the mention of the 4 days is significant because a very common rabbinic teaching of that day was that if a person died, the spirit of the dead man hovers over the body for 3 days. And throughout that 3-day period of hovering, there was always a very small possibility for resuscitation. But at the end of the 3rd day, by the 4th day, the spirit would have descended down into Sheol or Hades. Remember, this was rabbinic teaching. This was not biblical teaching. Now, the teaching was that from then on, after that 3-day period is gone, from then on, there was no possibility whatsoever of resuscitation. Only by a miracle of resurrection will the man live again. Now, we've already seen from Martha's comment, a common belief is that resurrection will happen in the last days when Messiah comes. And because this is the sign he did promise to give to the nation, he deliberately set the stage in such a way that they could not explain away this through a mere resuscitation. He waited for 4 days. And again, by their rabbinic theology, it was too late for resuscitation. The man could not come to life again. Lazarus has now been dead for 1 day too many. So if we understand the Jewish frame of reference, these little incidences like 4 days begins to make sense. In response now to Martha's objection, Jesus said unto her, "Said I not unto you that if you believe, you should see the glory of God?" So Jesus reminded her that if she believed, she would see the glory of God. That's in 11 verse 40. And at that point, they took away the stone. As he begins to pray, notice exactly for whom this miracle was being performed. Was it a favor to Mary and Martha? If that had been so, Lazarus could have been healed even from a distance without having to die. But notice verse 41, John 11, verse 41. "Father, I thank thee that thou heardest me, and I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the multitude which standeth around, I said it, that they may believe that thou didst send me." So that this miracle was clearly intended for the multitude. This was the one sign that he had been promising to give them on at least 2 previous occasions. Remember, this is a sign of Jonah. So when this sign is given, they need to respond to it. It was for the building of faith for those who would believe amongst the multitudes, and it was going to be one of the final signs to the nation. So in verse 43, Jesus now cries out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." In the Gospels and the New Testament, whenever the voice speaks referring to resurrection, it is always the voice of Messiah. And in the rapture passage, we see with a shout, Messiah's shout, and here we see Lazarus with the shout, and he is indeed resurrected in verse 44. It says he came forth bound hand and foot. So his face was bound. Jesus has to tell them to unwind him and let him go. You mightn't realize it, but there are 2 miracles here. One is the fact that Lazarus came to life, and the second is the fact that he was able to get out of the tomb bound hand and foot and couldn't see where he was going. So he was blinded, yet he was able to come out of the tomb into the open. He was able to walk in spite of being bound hand and foot. Now, this was unlike all the other miracles since paragraph 42. Remember, paragraph 42 was where we had Jesus being rejected by the leadership of Israel on the basis that he was demon-possessed. So this one here now is a miracle to serve as the sign from heaven for the multitudes. So the resurrection of Lazarus was the first sign of Jonah, the sign of resurrection. Now, we see the rejection of the first sign, and we see this in John chapter 11, verses 45 to 54. For the sign of Jonah, we now see 2 responses. In verse 45, we see the correct response to the raising of Lazarus. It says, many therefore of the Jews who came to Mary and Martha beheld that which Jesus did, believed on him. So we see many of the Jews responded correctly and exercised faith. The second response is by the others. Now, these who were still laboring under the leadership complex went away to the Pharisees and told them what things had taken place and what Jesus had done in verse 46. Now, remember that the Jews always look to their leaders to make their decisions for them. And that's what we're saying, the leadership complex here. So they're looking to the Pharisees to make a decision so that they can believe. Is he the Messiah or isn't he the Messiah? Now, the Pharisees realized that this was the sign which Jesus had been promising them, the sign of Jonah, for remember, he was speaking to them when he had said it. They would now have to respond. And in verse 47, we see that the Sanhedrin met. The chief priests, therefore, which are the Sadducees, and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, what do we do? For this man does many signs. Yeah, remember the Sanhedrin was composed of both Pharisees and Sadducees together. And the chief priests are those 24 Sadducees who headed up the course of priests. Now, they continued, if we let him thus alone, if we leave Jesus in what he's done, all men will believe on him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Notice here that their actual fear, there was no question that Jesus did perform the miracle that they heard he did. They're not questioning that miracle. There are too many witnesses to the contrary to contradict the miracle. But what is their fear? The real reason for what was happening here, what was that? Their real fear was the loss of their own positions of privilege and prominence. For if he was declared to be the Messiah, the Romans will see that as an act of rebellion against Rome. They'd invade the country and destroy it. And these Sanhedrin members will now lose their place of status and privilege. They're not worried about the fact that he is the Messiah. They're more worried about the fact that they could lose their positions. So in verse 49, at this point, Caiaphas, who was the acting high priest, he spoke. And he said, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Now Caiaphas took his leadership role, and he told them what they must do in spite of the many signs. It was better that Jesus should die rather than let the Romans see it as a revolt and wipe out the nation. Now, John, the gospel writer, sees where he sees here the irony in the closing stages of the life of the Messiah, because he's going to bring out several points of irony as we go through. And this is one of them, because in verse 52, now this he said not of himself, this is Caiaphas, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation and not for the nation only. And John adds, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God that are to be scattered abroad. Now, if we simply take the words of Caiaphas as they stand, they're absolutely true. One man was to die on behalf of the nation. However, Caiaphas meant them to be taken in a political way. We need to get rid of this man, Jesus, to save us from Roman destruction. That was the way he takes it. Jesus must die to save the nation. But what John points out in his ironic statement is that, taken at face value, Caiaphas' statement is true. Jesus will die on behalf of the nation. But because of his death, the nation will not utterly be destroyed, but someday will be regathered into a final restoration. And that was not what Caiaphas meant, but taken at face value, his words could be interpreted that way. He meant it one way, but God would fulfill it in another way. And in the same way, cast your mind back, in the same way that Joseph said to his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And we find it in Genesis 50, verse 20. Now, the response of the Sanhedrin to the first sign of Jonah was to carry the rejection even further. The initial rejection came back in paragraph 62. There, what they did was they simply proclaimed that Jesus was not the Messiah on the grounds that he was demon-possessed. But now in paragraph 122, we have the ultimate rejection, which went even further. Having reached their verdict, we see from verse 53 that from that day forth, they took counsel that they might put him to death. They sentenced Jesus to death. And from the result of their counsel to put him to death, we see in verse 54 that Jesus leaves Judea for the last time. The next time he does return to Judea, it is for the purpose of dying. He leaves and he heads up to Ephraim in the northern Judea. Ultimately, as with John the Baptist, what happened to the herald will happen to the king. The rejection would be for personal reasons, but the charge would be for something else. Now, just a quick review. The first messianic miracle, the healing of a Jewish leper, was when the intensive investigation of Messiah began. Result of the second messianic miracle, the casting out of the dumb demon, was the decree that Jesus was not the Messiah on the basis of demon possession. The result of the third messianic miracle, the healing of a man born blind, was that anyone who owned Jesus as Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And the final messianic witness for the nation was the sign of Jonah in Lazarus' resurrection after being dead for 4 days. Lazarus' resurrection resulted in the issue of a death warrant by the Sanhedrin. And the next sign of Jonah we're going to see where we'll see is Jesus being resurrected. Now, here's a prime example of the advantage of the way we study this in the thematic way over the geographical study, because here we see the relationship of the previous, what happened previously to what's happening now. Now, the personal witness to Caiaphas, we're going to see in Luke 17, 11 to 19. And this is the instruction in light of rejection. Luke 17, verse 11. It came to pass as they were on their way to Jerusalem that he was passing along the borders of Samaria and Galilee. So we're up along the border between Galilee and Samaria. This is just outside the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. And Jesus and his disciples are traveling towards Jerusalem for the Passover of his crucifixion. Now, Jesus is approached by 10 lepers. He entered into a certain village. There met him 10 men that were lepers who stood afar off. So these guys meet him. They stood at a distance because they were lepers. And that's the same reason why they lifted up their voices to talk to him so they could be heard. Remember, the healing of leprosy was understood to be one of the 3 messianic miracles. Last time we heard of Jesus doing this, he had healed only 1 leper and had sent him to the priesthood. And as a result, the priesthood had to make an investigation with all its rituals, which lasted 8 days, to confirm that the leper was ritually clean. The healing of that 1 leper had also meant that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah. This is back in paragraph 46. Now, as a result of that, the stage of investigation of Jesus's messianic claims had begun. Now, this time, Jesus doesn't heal 1, he heals 10. And they said to him, "Master, have mercy on us." Remember, we now have personal need. Personal need is the basis. Now, according to the law of Moses, for those of you who don't know, he only does healings now or miracles on the basis of personal need and faith. So we have personal need here. According to the law of Moses, they must go to the priesthood for the cleansing process. Notice what he says to them. "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And it came to pass as they went that they were made clean. This time the message would reach Caiaphas, the high priest, that not 1 man, but 10 men had reported their healing and wished to go through the rituals of being declared clean by the priesthood. Now, one of the 10 lepers was also a Samaritan. And what's just been done here appears to be the response of Jesus to the high priest Caiaphas, who had just condemned him to death in the previous paragraph. Now, 10 times over, Caiaphas would have to arrange with the priesthood for an intensive investigation as to the nature of the healing as per the Mosaic law in Leviticus 13 and 14. 10 times over, the verdict would be the same. These lepers had been healed by the man Jesus. Here we see a bit of Jesus's humor here. The man who had denied his messiahship, Caiaphas, must initialize 10 investigations, which by Jewish theology itself meant 10 times over, we have a claim with evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. So what we have here is the evidence to make Caiaphas a personal witness. The high priest Caiaphas, he gets a 10-fold witness to Jesus' messiahship. 10 times he has to sacrifice 2 birds. 10 times he has to investigate for 7 days, every day for 7 days. 10 times he has to confess, yes, they were lepers. 10 times he has to confess, yes, they are healed. 10 times he has to hear Jesus did the healing. But for the disciples here, it's actually a lesson in thankfulness. Because of the 10 men, only the Samaritan returned to thank Jesus for the healing. And he said unto him, arise and go your way, your faith has made you whole. And he was healed on the basis of his faith. He too went to the Jewish priesthood, revealing that he no longer adhered to Samaritanism as a religion. Again, we see the motif here, healing on the basis of personal need and personal faith. Now in Luke 17, verses 20 to 21, we see the new form of the kingdom program. Being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God comes, he answered them and said, the kingdom of God comes not with observation, neither shall they say, lo, here or there. For lo, the kingdom of God is within you. Now here the Pharisees asked Jesus when the kingdom of God was coming. And we saw some time ago that Jesus' teaching method changed after Israel committed the unpardonable sin in paragraph 62, Matthew 12. In the parables, which replaced his clear teaching, Jesus defined the new form of God's kingdom program, which is the mystery kingdom. And this is, we see the response here in Luke 17, verses 20 to 21. This kingdom is within them. It's within them, he told the Pharisees. And the Greek term translated within actually means among. So this kingdom was among or in the midst of the Pharisees. As a result of his rejection, the Messianic kingdom would not be set up at this time, but it was replaced temporarily with the mystery kingdom, which is invisible. The mystery kingdom was among them, but not visibly observable like the Messianic kingdom will be. Now, those amillennialists, those who do not believe that the Bible teaches an earthly kingdom and a final restoration for the Jewish people, use this as one of their favorite verses. And they say that Jesus says the kingdom is within you. So the kingdom of God is only indwelling the believer. The kingdom is only spiritual and indwells the believer. They say there's no physical kingdom. But notice who he is talking to here. He wasn't talking to believers. He was talking to unbelieving Pharisees. And even the indwelling kingdom is not within unbelievers of any kind. So Jesus never negated the belief in an earthly kingdom. However, since the Messianic kingdom offer was withdrawn, the mystery kingdom has temporarily replaced it. So pretty much what he's saying is that you do not need to look for the kingdom in signs because it's king, and so its presence is right before you. Basically, the mystery kingdom covers the age between the first and second comings of the Messiah. The best single word to define the mystery kingdom is the term Christendom. It describes conditions on this earth while the king is absent from the earth and is in heaven. So this kingdom includes a time span that goes from the rejection of the king in Matthew 12 until the acceptance of the king in the closing days of the Great Tribulation. So obviously the mystery kingdom includes the church age from Acts 2 until the rapture, and also includes the tribulation. Now, concerning that, we have some instruction concerning the second coming. And this again we see in Luke 17, verses 22 to 37. So after responding to the Pharisees in parables, Jesus now spoke clearly to his disciples in terms they could easily understand. Remember, he speaks to the masses in parables, but then he takes his disciples aside and he explains in simple language to them. And later on in the Olivet Discourse, he delivered a very detailed sermon on eschatology. And we'll see when we get down there. Now, on the issue of the second coming, Jesus gave 6 lessons. First one, in verse 23. They shall say to you, lo there, lo here. Go not away, nor follow after them. So when the Messiah returns, all will see him. First lesson. The second coming will not be like the first. For as the lightning, when it lightens out of the one part under the heaven, shines unto the other part under the heaven, so shall the Son of Man be in his day. That's verse 24, Luke 17. So this will be preceded by a period of time when the Messiah will not be present. The days will come when you shall desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you shall not see it, because he's not here. That's verse 22. Second lesson. This is Luke 17, verse 25. He said that before the second coming could take place, several other things must happen. First of all, he must suffer many things and be rejected of this generation. The emphasis is on the generation that rejected him. Remember, they don't understand his two-coming program. So before the second coming and the setting up of the kingdom, he must suffer and be rejected. And notice here, it was that specific generation, not the next generation, but that specific generation. Third instruction in verses 26 to 30, the tribulation must come first. And this will follow a time of normal activity on the earth. Verse 26, Luke 17, and as it came to pass in the days of Noah, even so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, even as it came to pass in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But in the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. After the same manner shall it be in the day that the Son of Man is revealed. So people will be eating, drinking, marrying, buying, selling, building. In fact, all things necessary for the sustaining and perpetuation of the human race. You can see this also in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 to 11. 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 to 11. So while men are saying peace and safety, suddenly the day of the Lord, the tribulation will hit, occurring unexpectedly while life is just going along nice and normally. Fourth instruction, Luke 17, 31 to 33. He speaks of how those who are on the earth at this time, when the tribulation starts, will have to make a choice to believe or not to believe, to accept or to reject. They need to take immediate action to escape, not looking back. In that day, he that shall be on the housetop and his goods in the house, let him not go down to take them away, and let him that is in the field likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. Whosoever shall seek to gain his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. The moment one believes, there is no looking back, as did Lot's wife. The fifth thing, the second coming will occur only after the tribulation and the judgment. And we see that in Luke 17, 34 to 36. I say unto you, in that night there shall be 2 men on one bed, the one shall be taken, the other shall be left. There shall be 2 women grinding together, the one shall be taken, and the other shall be left. So one is taken for salvation, the other left for judgment. The picture here is of the separation that will take place at the Son of Man's return, and not to anything else preceding that return. So it's about the tribulation period and the second coming. Sixth instruction, having heard all these details about Jesus' second coming, the disciples questioned where he would appear. And they answering, saying to him, "Where, Lord? Where is this going to happen?" And Jesus gives a cryptic response, and here he presupposes Old Testament knowledge. And he said unto them, "Where the body is, there will the eagles also be gathered together." Now, in Greek, the word translated as eagles can also mean vultures. So when animals are used symbolically in the Hebrew scriptures, they often refer to nations, and you can see that in Isaiah chapter 34, verses 1 to 7. And so it's fair to say in this verse, the vultures represent Gentiles who gathered together to devour the body. And from nations gathering together in order to perform an act of aggression, this would be the Gentile armies in a military act. Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14, Ezekiel has a vision of the valley of dry bones, and that would correlate here to the body of Israel. So the answer to the question is, where is the second coming, Lord? Where is it? Wherever the body of Israel is, that is where the Gentile armies will gather together. And where the Gentile armies are gathered together, that will be the place of the second coming. Now, according to Micah chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, the remnant of Israel will be in a place called Bozrah in Hebrew, but we know it better today is by its Greek name, which is Petra. Jeremiah 49, 13 to 14, Jeremiah 49, 13 to 14 states that this is where the Gentile armies will come against Israel. And Isaiah 34, 1 to 7, Isaiah 34, 1 to 7, and Isaiah 63, 1 to 6, Isaiah 63, 1 to 6, confirm that this is also the place of the second coming. Isaiah 34, 6 says, "The Lord has a sword, it is sated with blood, it is gorged with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, a great slaughter in the land of Edom." So that's when the Lord comes to deliver the remnant from Bozrah. Now, we have an instruction in prayer found in Luke 18, 1 to 14. And here, after he's just instructed his disciples about, future things, eschatological things, Jesus taught two principles concerning prayer: persistence or perseverance, and humility. First lesson we see in Luke 18, verses 1 to 8. And this is on perpetual or persistent prayer. Now, this is in relationship to the previous paragraph in the light of the second coming. He spake a parable unto them to the end that they ought always to pray and not to faint. This is especially a prayer to be prayed in relationship to the second coming. Since the kingdom is not going to be set up at this point of time, they still ought to pray as he taught them earlier, "Thy kingdom come." And we found it right back in Matthew chapter 6, verse 10. And he now encourages them by telling them a story of the importunate widow. The importunate widow. This is a story about a widow who came to a judge demanding, "Avenge me of mine adversary." Luke 18:3. Now, the judge was not too concerned about justice, but because the widow kept returning, he finally gave in and granted her request. Her persistence, not the righteousness of the judge, which we see in verse 6, accomplished her goal. He just got tired of her coming back and asking. Now, in the parable, Jesus pointed out that if an unrighteous judge would finally respond because of the persistence of the petitioner, how much more would God, who is righteous, respond? Now, The application of the prayer request is in verse 7. And shall not God avenge his elect, which cry to him day and night, and his long suffering over them? I say unto you that he will avenge them speedily. Jesus' coming will avenge all wrongs. And then in Luke 18:8, he says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? The coming of the Son of Man is the coming of the Messianic kingdom. So this is in reference to the second coming. Now remember that thy kingdom come is the pattern for prayer that Jesus has given his disciples twice. Now we know that the second coming is going to be a reality. Eventually it's going to come, but the principle about praying for the second coming is this, that the certainty of that which is asked for should lead us to continually pray. We are to continue in persistent prayer for the second coming and that his kingdom come. And this shows our faith in the coming of the King and his kingdom when we don't give up praying for it. So the believer should persistently pray, your kingdom come. The second principle concerns humility in prayer, verses 9 to 14 of Luke 18. The stated purpose of this lesson deals with those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and set all others at naught. Verse 9. To show his point, Jesus presents the second parable, the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. So these two men in verse 10 went to the temple to pray at the regular prayer time at the temple. And he deals with the Pharisee first. The Pharisee used his prayers as an opportunity to be able to show off his righteousness. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I'm not as the rest of men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. That's verses 11 to 12 of Luke 18. So first of all, he let God know what a great man he is. He doesn't do any of those gross things that these others are doing, and he was probably quite right in saying that he was not as the rest of men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. However, these are not the only sins of this world. He then begins to give a testimony which turns out more to be a braggamoney. He followed, he tells us that he followed Pharisaic traditions. He said, I fast twice in the week, Mondays and Thursdays. That's their fast days. In addition, I give tithes of all that I get. So he gave tithes of all that he received. And in fact, the Pharisees were very careful to tithe of even the smallest seed. You can have a look at that in Matthew 23, verse 23. Matthew 23, verse 23. So prayer of this Pharisee was a prayer of self-righteousness. Prayer was a time, for him was a time or an opportunity to display his righteousness, and the basis of his approach to God was on the basis of his own good works. His fasting twice a week, and he was careful to tithe of everything. It was his own self-righteousness. In fact, he was simply telling God how lucky God was to have him on his team. Now we read of the publican in verses 13 and 14. He approached God on the basis of personal need and God's mercy. Notice the nature of the publican's prayer of humility to God. First of all, he stood afar off. That's 18, verse 13. He did not think himself worthy to get too close to the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Second, he wouldn't lift up so much as his eyes onto heaven. He kept his eyes downcast because he felt truly burdened by his sins. Third, he smote his breast. He was so grieved by his sins that he afflicted his body, thus displaying a physical response to his sin before God. Fourth, he pleaded, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This is all verse 13 of Luke 18. And the Greek word for be merciful really means be propitious or make propitiation for. To propitiate means to satisfy the wrath of God. And the proper place of propitiation was the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. So when the publican prayed, "Be merciful to me, a sinner," he was basically asking, look upon me as you look upon the mercy seat and atone for my sins. Now, this was a valid Old Testament prayer, but it is not a valid New Testament prayer, because by the death of Messiah, so we're told, God has been propitiated. But here we were still in the Old Testament context, so it's a valid prayer back then. So while the Pharisees approached God on the basis of his self-righteousness and his own good works, the publican approached God on the basis of his own spiritual needs and God's mercy. And the result was that this man went down to his house justified, declared righteous, rather than the other. The principle for this section here again is that everyone that exalts himself shall be humbled, but he that humbles himself shall be exalted. That's in Luke 18, verse 14. So the basis for proper basis for approaching God involves three things: recognition of one's sins and sinfulness, the recognition of being unworthy, and having a sense of mourning and repentance for sins. And this is a teaching on humble prayer. Now we have the instruction on divorce. And this is found in Matthew 19, verses 1 to 12, and Mark 10, verses 1 to 12. Now, on the question of divorce and remarriage, the Pharisees were divided between two rabbinic schools, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. Shammai and Hillel. Now, the school of Shammai took a very narrow interpretation of Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4, and said that ervat davar, that's ervat davar, meaning a matter or manner of uncleanness of behavior, and only that's the only reason, to be more specific, fornication, sexual immorality. That's the only reason for divorce, according to the school of Shammai. So the school of Shammai permitted divorce only on the basis of moral transgression, and indeed exclusively to adultery. However, the school of Hillel, very liberal, more liberal school, interpreted the expression ervat davar as meaning uncleanness or anything else. So any grounds could be grounds for divorce. So if a wife burned her husband's supper or oversalted his food, or if he found someone more beautiful, they were all grounds for divorce under the school of Hillel. And this is still recorded in the Talmud. Eventually, after 90 BC, the school of Hillel won out, and Hillel's interpretation became the official interpretation in the rabbinic community. Now, the Pharisees presented the issue to Jesus as he departed from Galilee and came near the border of Judea. So he's still on the east side of the Jordan in what was then known as Perea. And in Matthew 19, 2 to 3, we see here a great multitude followed him, and he healed them there. And there came unto him Pharisees trying him and saying, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? So we see the multitudes, and now the stage is set for the Pharisaic encounter. When the religious leaders questioned the legality of divorce, they were not really seeking an answer, but they were tempting Jesus. They were trying to trap him. Reading the account, one must ask how this served as a temptation. Well, since whichever way he answered, at least one school of the Pharisees would support his position. But the answer lies in the fact that Jesus was in Perea. He was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, who was the same person who ordered John the Baptizer's beheading due to his preaching against the illegal divorce of Herodias and her marriage or her remarriage to Antipas. That's why John lost his head. The Pharisees asked Jesus the question while he was in Antipas's territory, hoping his answer would offend Herodias, because she got offended last time with John the Baptist, so that her husband Herod would do to Jesus what he had done to John. And if you look at the way they asked the question, you'll see that they were more into Hillel's view, which is you can divorce for any reason. Jesus responded with 5 points. First of all, God's original intent for marriage was that it be permanent. We see that in Matthew 19:4-6. He says, he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife. Two shall become one flesh. So no more two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So when the Pharisees now ask the follow-up question, why then did Moses command to give a bill of divorcement to put her away? This is in Matthew 19:7. Jesus made his second point. Moses did not command divorce. He only permitted divorce because of the hardness of their hearts. The biblical ideal is always forgiveness, restoration, and reunion. Jesus made 2 declarations publicly, but privately he taught 3 additional lessons to his disciples when they asked, can you please explain it some more? In making his third point, Jesus opposed the one-sidedness of Jewish divorce law. In rabbinic thinking, the man does not commit adultery against his wife. Only a wife commits adultery against a husband. And we saw this reflected in the situation where a woman caught in adultery was brought before Jesus, but there was no man brought. Jesus now teaches that either mate can be the guilty party. Jesus declared that adultery goes both ways, and Matthew, writing to Jews, only mentioned divorcing the wife. And I say, this is Matthew 19:9, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. He that marries her when she's put away commits adultery. Because remember, under Jewish law, a wife can never divorce her husband. And currently, well, up until recently, probably still is, a woman in Israel cannot legally divorce her husband, according to the religious law that governs family matters. And in Israel, no civil divorce law exists. Now, Mark, writing to Romans who practice divorce both ways, mentioned both options. You see that in Mark chapter 10, 11-12. He said unto them, whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another commits adultery against her. And if she herself shall put away her husband and marry another, she commits adultery. Because the Romans had it both ways. Now, in his fourth point, Jesus identified fornication as the only basis for divorce. And that's Matthew 19, verse 9. The term fornication generally describes immorality, including adultery, premarital sex, homosexuality, incest, bestiality. Under the Mosaic law, adultery was not grounds for divorce because a person guilty of adultery would be stoned to death, making the partner a widow or a widower free to remarry. However, the Hebrew Bible stipulated 2 other grounds for divorce. The first was sexual incompatibility, which we find in Deuteronomy 24, 1-3. The second was religious incompatibility in Ezra chapter 10, verses 10-11, Ezra 10, 10-11, and Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 30, Nehemiah 10, verse 30. The husband of a Gentile who worshipped pagan gods was commanded to divorce her. In both cases, divorce automatically severed the marriage and permitted remarriage. Clearly, the Hebrew scriptures always permitted remarriage following a proper divorce. The New Testament rescinded both of these 2 Old Testament grounds for divorce. Sexual incompatibility is rescinded by Jesus in this particular section in the Gospels, and religious incompatibility is rescinded in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 12-13. 1 Corinthians 7, 12-13, where Paul teaches that a believer cannot divorce a mate because he or she is an unbeliever. At the same time, the New Testament lays down 2 new grounds for divorce. The first is fornication, which we've seen in the verses previously. The second is where 2 unbelievers marry and one of them becomes a believer during the marriage. And we find this in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 to 16. 1 Corinthians 7, 12 to 16. If the unbelieving spouse wants a divorce on those grounds, Paul instructs the believer not to fight it, but to grant that divorce. The remarriage principle remains the same. A valid biblical divorce automatically allows for a remarriage. And while in the Gospels, fornication is the only God-given basis for divorce, divorce is not commanded, but only permitted. The biblical ideal always was and will always be forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus sided with the school of Shammai in this position and against the school of Hillel, although it's not apparent from these verses if the innocent party in a divorce is allowed to remarry. Clearly, the guilty party cannot remarry. But Jesus stayed silent about the innocent party, causing the church to take two different views about this issue. Some extend the prohibition to both parties and do not believe in remarriage for either the guilty or the innocent. Others limit it to the guilty party, but allow the innocent one to remarry. Either way, the basis for divorce and remarriage is limited, and a valid biblical divorce automatically allows for a remarriage. Now, the disciples respond to Jesus' narrow position by saying, if the case of the man is so with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. And we see that in Matthew 19, verse 10. In other words, what they're saying is that if we can't divorce their wives for any reason we wanted to, then it was better not to marry. And this response reflecting a very low view of marriage. And it now leads to Jesus's fifth point. He says, not all men can receive this saying, but they to whom it is given. That's chapter 19, verse 11. One of the 19 gifts of the Holy Spirit is singleness, gift of singleness, which you see in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 to 7. Only those to whom it is given should choose this option of singleness. Marriage is the norm. It's ideal for a person to remain single because their status allows them to devote all of their time to the Lord's work, while a married person cannot. Now, Jesus just went on to say that there are three categories of eunuchs. There are eunuchs that were so born from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs that were made eunuchs by men. There are eunuchs that made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, receive it. So some are born eunuchs through birth defect. Others are forced to become eunuchs because they were castrated for one purpose or another, for one reason or another. However, some become eunuchs voluntarily by making themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. These have the gift of singleness, choosing to stay unmarried for the kingdom of heaven. And this is the gift of singleness here is a choice for these people. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. That's our contact details there, and you can contact us.